Hello, Paul Bloom.
Hi, Bob. How are you? How's the social distancing going?
I feel pretty distant right now from you. You're in Toronto. I'm in New Jersey.
I'm in Toronto.
Nobody else is in the room with me, so I don't sense immediate peril.
Our borders have been officially, as of today, closed, but yet through the miracle of the internet, Canada and the US.
The border between Canada and the U.S. Yeah.
Yes.
By mutual agreement, I might say. This is
by mutual agreement.
There's no bitterness.
That's right.
So does that mean, wait a second, you teach at Yale, you're now teaching virtually. Well, I should introduce this. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show. Available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You're Paul Bloom, famous professor at Yale. I don't think that this moment in history is a good time to note that you wrote a book called Against Empathy, so let's skip that one.
Let's get right past
what other
that.
books?
My very first book was on how children learn the meanings of words. I wrote Descartes' Baby, mostly about religion, how pleasure works, about pleasure.
Right.
Just Babies, about morality and the origins of morality.
I think we should pronounce it just if they're going to really get the pun.
Yeah, it was a pun. In the end, it may have been ill-advised. I got a lot of emails saying, your book isn't only about babies.
It's not just
and then they got very angry. There's angry Amazon reviews of that sort. You say just babies, but there was some other stuff there too. And I say, no, justice and justice, as in, it doesn't work. And I'm currently finishing off a book. It's in the hands of my editor on the pleasures of suffering.
Oh, yes. You've been working on that for some time. We've discussed that.
Yeah.
Well,
but
you don't mean the kind of suffering that's going on now, I think.
No.
You mean like eating spicy foods, possibly edgier stuff than that, but not
possibly edgier, a bit of edgier stuff. I actually very carefully in my book distinguish between chosen suffering and unchosen suffering. Mm-hmm. And I say unchosen suffering is for the most part as bad as you would think it is. And what we are living through now is definitely unchosen. Unchosen
suffering. So that's what we're going to talk about. And I'm going to try to draw on your expertise as a psychologist and maybe focus at least a little on how people are reacting to this, maybe how you're coping with it, how I'm coping with it, but how people seem to be coping, your observations about that. It's a strange thing. I mean, people have noted that we've never gone through anything like this. I don't remember anything. What's your take so far, viewed from Toronto, where the sense of threat is not, I guess, as great? I mean, I'm in the greater New York area. I'm an hour from New York, and we have cases. I mean, I can see from my window the elementary school room my daughters went some years ago, and there's a teacher there who's in the hospital with it apparently. But in Toronto, what is?
Well, in Canada, I think Toronto and Vancouver are the two major hotspots, and there have been cases in Toronto. I get to see, so there's not a sense of panic, but restaurants and bars are closed. Every day I take at least 3-mile walk through the streets, and there are other people in the streets. They're walking dogs, they're hanging out, but the city's closed down.
Yeah.
The city's closed down. People are pretty serious about social distancing.
Yeah.
I get to see the Canadian response to it. The Canadian Prime Minister gives a little press conference every day, and it's much less dramatic than Trump's, but similar along certain lines. A lot of money being handed out for businesses, for individuals. Mm-hmm. Testing has been less of a problem here. My partner has been tested. Actually, she came down with a fever, and she was tested when taken to her doctor.
How did the test come out?
Negative.
Okay.
He is fine. Just a bug.
Yeah, the testing bottleneck, I think we're pretty much through that. I mean, they did 25,000 tests or so yesterday, so the worst is over there. But anyway, go ahead.
So right now is the situation where you are, that if you developed a fever, you could just call your doctor and they would arrange for you to get a test?
I assume we're either there or within a couple of days of that. It's really ramped up. When it finally did start ramping up, it was pretty fast. But it's a strange it's changing so fast.
Yeah.
I mean, I was in New York less than 2 weeks ago, attending a gathering of, 40, 50 people in an apartment, riding the subway.
Yeah.
And I mean, there was I brought hand wipes. I wasn't fooling around. I mean, I was aware, but now, I mean, the streets, there was nothing all that different. Slightly less crowded subways, slightly less crowded train to get there. But now it's like a ghost town. And you wonder, I mean, we're taping this Friday. It'll post Sunday or Monday. And you wonder if even by then the tenor of the discussion will almost, I mean, at some point it could be very, very grave. Right now, people still, they don't joke about the death and suffering, but there's a certain amount of levity on Twitter about, cooped up with the kids jokes and stuff.
Yeah.
And you wonder, will that last? Should it last?
Things have been changing extremely fast. I mean, you're reminding me that my partner and I have had plans to go to Aruba this week. We should be on the beach in Aruba sipping pina coladas and everything. And on Friday, a week ago, we were deliberating whether to leave on our flight. And it was by Saturday we decided not to. And then by Sunday, we turned out that Aruba has closed its borders. But these things are happening extremely quickly. What seemed like a sort of rational thing to do a week ago or a day ago is changing. Although I see on Twitter all these partying spring breakers in Florida and people filling the pubs in London. Yeah,
tensions between Gen Z and boomers have not been subdued by this whole experience, I would say.
Do you think they're trying to kill us, Bob?
Would you blame them? I mean,
we've messed up the world, and now it's going to take us out.
Yeah, they didn't start this thing. Who did anyway? I mean, one big question though is, in what ways will this bring people together, and in what ways, if any, will it tear them apart? In principle, it's a common enemy, but it actually threatens different people to different extents. Some people get blamed for exacerbating it or for starting it. Like, it started in China. That's a whole issue. Yeah. And I'm curious, to see it play out. It's happening in a very, of course, obviously polarized political environment in the U.S. And in some ways, the polarization is just using it as a medium, to play out in new ways. I don't know.
And I've heard people make opposite predictions. On the one hand, I've heard the claim this is going to make us very nationalistic. This is what these things do. Mm-hmm. It's going to fuel anti-immigrant sentiment. It's going to bring Donald Trump to a next term as president. And then I've heard people who say, no, this is sort of the crisis we've been waiting for that will pull the world together, make us more cosmopolitan. We will face it as a planet. We will see our interconnectedness, and it will drive Trump from office because we're repelled by his poor reaction to the crisis and his xenophobia and so on. And it's interesting. I've seen perfectly smart people predict totally opposite things.
Well, yeah, it makes sense because, in principle, it could make us all cosmopolitans. On the other hand, you can see how from parts of America, cosmopolitanism is the problem. If you're in red state America or a red part of a blue state or whatever, where did the virus enter the country? Coastal metropolises. Why? Yeah. Because there is a lot of interaction between them and the outside world by these coastal elites. So you can imagine that narrative. I'm writing about this actually for the Nonzero newsletter right now. It'll be out by the time this posts, but I don't expect Trump to explicitly invoke that narrative. Like, I'm blaming the blue states, but you can imagine how it might look like that. Because it is getting closer and closer to people who weren't initially affected by it. Where is it coming from? It's coming from the blue states.
Yeah. Trump, calls it the Chinese virus. It's a big thing.
Yeah, I write about that.
To some extent, I agree with those who say this is a classic Trumpian move where now all the liberals obligingly get really upset at this.
Right.
And, we ignore the far more substantive issues. But in some cases, it's heartfelt, idea that this is going to America first sort of thing, blame the Chinese, increase tensions, all sort of red meat to Trump space.
Yeah, that's what I mean. A lot of divisive rhetoric you can imagine making sense for him politically. I guess like that. I guess that's an example of something that works for him. Certainly it works with parts of his base. I don't know, but I will say a week ago, more Americans disapproved of his handling of the crisis than approved. That has flipped. So now approval is like 54 or something, disapproval 45. And that's almost an exact flip of what it was a week ago.
And in part, I think it's flipped because over the last week, he's actually done some reasonable things.
Yeah. I mean, if you should be able to use this if you're a president to elevate your stature. Classically, crises afflicting nations, at least in the first instance, raise the approval level of the president. Yeah. It's the rally around the flag effect. Yeah.
So we're at war with the virus, and wartime presidents are popular.
Yeah. And he is getting better at handling it. I mean,
he is, though. There was a terrible news conference a few hours ago.
Well, you call it terrible. This is, it's a Rorschach test. I didn't see the whole thing. Are you talking about him dressing down the reporter who asked him what he had to say to Americans who are fearful? Yeah. I'll bet that played well in parts of his base. You got to remember, a lot of Americans go into this just not liking the media to begin with. And, it wasn't a gotcha question, but it was slightly aggressive, like the subtext, he said, what do you have to say to fearful Americans? And the subtext was kind of like, you haven't done that yet, Yeah.
The response was, for anybody else, was bizarre.
Oh, sure.
And any other president would have said, well, we really want to support you. Don't panic. It would say, in some way, it was a softball question that any politician would have responded.
And his reply was what? I'd say you're a terrible journalist or something like that?
Yeah, he says you're a terrible journalist from a terrible organization. And I call it Concast, not Comcast. And, and then he ends the press conference by, of course, blaming Obama. By saying we've inherited a horrible, infrastructure from the previous administration. It's vintage.
It is odd that he doesn't let that go, because you would think tactically that would be optimal, right? Just let that go. I mean, you've got the people, the people who love that love you. Just right. You can take them for granted, and you got an election coming up. Why not? Embrace this opportunity to be the great unifier, but guess not. But I so far, whatever he's doing seems to have worked in some sense for him. So, how do you? What's your observation about how people are handling this? Are they overreacting? Underreacting?
No, I think
you don't think so.
I think this may be because I'm overreacting or because I'm spending too much time on Twitter. I'm not an expert in any of the issues of the disease itself, but I have read catastrophic projections, and I think there's a general consensus that we should be doing a lot of social distancing, and that the people who are failing to do so are either being stupid or they are being.
Well, if they're old, they're being stupid. If they're young, they're being immoral.
Cruel. They're being cruel. And so here's the one thing, we talked before about what I'm doing here talking to you, because I'm not an expert in any of this, but I am interested in the psychology of it. And what I'll say is that in a lot of ways, this is like climate change, where it's a difficult crisis for us to respond to. For one thing, there's no person. We're not fighting anybody. It's not really a war. There's no malevolent force, and malevolent enemies really tend to drive us. Things like climate change and pandemics don't affect us psychologically the same way. The second thing is that the consequences of this are to some extent invisible. We are told that perfectly healthy people with no symptoms can spread the virus, and that's difficult to appreciate.
Yeah.
And then we're told that the effects of it are, and we're told because it's true, are exponential. Meaning that you're looking at the world right now. You're in Princeton there. You're looking at all your fellow citizens are just happy and everything. The hospitals are not overcrowded. And you're told that the math says in 7 days, you may be like Italy. And it just doesn't feel like it's going to happen. It's like people who tell us, in so and so many years, we are going to have a catastrophic environmental disasters due to climate change. But I look outside and, weather's kind of nice. Yeah. So it's difficult for us to truly apprehend these sorts of crises.
Right. Although, there's significantly less kind of obvious incentive to take climate change seriously, right? Because it isn't just like right now it's okay. It's going to be okay next year. On the other hand, in one way, this is the two are the reverse in the sense that if there's anybody climate change should make you worry about, it's your descendants, maybe your children when they're older or the grandchildren. The weird thing about this is it's the opposite. It's almost all things that terrify entire nations, war, terrorism, and so on, lead people to be fearful about themselves and about their children. This one, you should only be real fearful about yourself if you're beyond a certain age. And almost no one has real rational reason to be super fearful about their children. Look, they can die from this. There can be lung damage and so on, but it's just a weird, I'm not aware of, there having been a pair like this where, people are more worried about their parents than about their children.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Though, to be a little bit more negative, I have heard projections that say that for every person who dies because of the virus, there will be somebody else who dies because there aren't hospital beds or doctors or emergency rooms ready for them. So that healthy young people will injure themselves on motorcycles and shootings and rock climbing and whatever. And many of them will die because the sort of medical care normally be available for them won't be around.
Yeah.
And so in some way that sort of spreads out the risk of it.
Yeah. The exponential part is going to become evident pretty soon.
And it's not like we can't see it. It's Italy. It's,
right.
It's other countries.
Now we have done the social distancing. Like we started that about, 10 days earlier than I think Italy did in the, in terms of where in the cycle they were. Yeah. So there is a chance that, we won't get there. But we don't know. And it's frustrating kind of taking these dramatic measures and not getting the feedback right away because there's a couple of reasons we will not even start getting a clue as to whether this has been effective for like a week from now. And even then it'll be kind of ambiguous. But I don't know. It's strange.
So how do you think this is going to change the world? Imagine, we get a vaccine a year from now. We get antivirals before then. Maybe there's cycles people talk about of social distancing where, we go back to normal in August or September. And then in November, it starts to spread again and we have to respond. But how's this going to change things?
Well, first of all, you haven't even talked about the economic dimension. It may be that we pretty much have to stop social distancing for a while to avoid a complete global depression. I don't know. Once it's over, it'll be over, if that's your question. And I don't know, the lasting residue will probably be, taking better precautions of various kinds at the institutional level, including, I would think, at the global level, World Health Organization and so on. But I don't know, what kind of thing do you have in mind?
I don't know, everything from the mundane to, the mundane is the fact that universities and colleges and to some extent high schools and so on are moving to online teaching. will have some long-term effect. I mean, the long-term effect might be we realize that online teaching really sucks and we should avoid it forever. But I think to some extent there are useful models that are being established, and it may actually in some way transform higher education.
Well, yeah. I mean, we may find out. I mean, if you want an example of a good effect, we may realize we don't need to consume nearly so much in the way of fossil fuels to keep the economy humming. A lot of work can be done remotely. Now, this also may be unfortunate news for people in your line of work. Now, you were telling me before we started recording that this isn't very taxing for you because as it happens, now what's the deal? You had already taught this course and there's a version of it on Coursera. So the video lectures already exist.
So I'm teaching introduction psychology this semester, and I taught up until spring break, and then this crisis has happened, and now the university is going to start up again, but this time online. And I taught this course on Coursera. I actually tweeted out a link to the course, and I know you've taught on Coursera as well, and which is an intro psych course. Now it's not the same as I give in my class. I think what I give in my class is actually a little bit better. They're longer lectures, they're more details. I get some student interactions, but they're kind of a substitute. And this is, and so I'm putting those on, and I'm also having we're also having sections where we can talk to the students one-on-one. I've had this great group of teaching fellows working with me, and, we're coping. And I have to say, we were talking about this a little bit before. I could complain for a while about the effects of social distancing on my life, but I'm sure we both know people for whom this is horrific. I mean, put aside the disease itself. I have family members whose businesses are going to collapse. I know people who have canceled weddings, who cannot go to the funeral of somebody they love. I mean, the amount of real pain involved in this makes the sort of inconvenience, at least the inconvenience I'm going through, incredibly minor in comparison. There's must be a million stories of again, forgetting when people get sick, just the economic collapse of people's businesses, people's life savings is horrible.
No, the YMCA where I swam daily until it closed a week ago, there's a guy that I talk to every day, gives me a towel, and he said, when there was word of them closing, he said, this is my only source of income, and there's a ton of people like that. And, the government is doing things, but it's a pretty blunt instrument. I mean, a lot of this money is going to go to people who don't especially need it. And some people who need it aren't going to get as much as they need. But yeah, it's a completely new experiment in how much you can slow down an economy without the results being catastrophic. We have no idea. And that's why I wonder, there are these two approaches to handling this. There's the nip it in the bud, which I guess they've done in South Korea and apparently even in China, even though it got to be a pretty big bud before they nipped it. And then there's, you've heard this, well, you just flatten the curve and you reconcile yourself to this not being over until so much of the population is immune by virtue of having had the thing that it really ceases to spread very rapidly. And the object of the game is to slow the spread down enough so that at no point do you really tax your medical resources. At least you can take care of the sick people. Yeah. That's reaching so-called herd immunity. And one thing I'm wondering is whether as the economic consequences of this become apparent, we don't have to settle for something closer to just flattening the curve a little and settling for the herd immunity, I know the UK was really looking at that pretty seriously for a while, but the numbers are horrific. You say half of Americans might get it. And then of those 1% or so will die. And then you're looking at, 1 to 2 million people dying. Yeah, but it's not like that's a constant of nature. I mean, for example, if everyone over the age of 60 does extreme social distancing, really isolates themselves, that changes the number very significantly.
Yeah, that's true.
And, that's true. I mean, the other thing I was thinking is, now that they're going to be testing more, if people who test positive and then go through it, they know they're immune. I'm wondering if there should be a way of like certifying them as immune, and then they can play certain roles. And also they can just get out. They're allowed to get out and spend money and you know, inject some life into the economy. Does that seem too creepy? Like
No,
people with like eyes on their, you know, letter I on their forehead or something? We don't.
Well, you know, I forget who said this. Somebody, you know, suggested if there could be a system where you have a flashing light if you are contagious, the problem would go away very easily. Mm-hmm. And equivalently, if you have this green light that says you cannot get it, the problem would also go away. If you could coordinate people, if there was a test that you could take and then 5 minutes later it tells you whether or not you got it, and this was made public in some way, it then becomes so much easier to contain it without any of the catastrophic economic consequences. Right now, the problem is nobody knows. Everybody does social distancing because nobody knows who has it.
Yeah. Have you, I don't know how prevalent the disease is in Toronto, but have you gotten to the point where you're in situations where you start thinking about like what you've touched and because like, especially when I'm in New York, but increasingly, even when I'm at home, as the thing spreads, it's like, once you start thinking about it, you can go crazy and you realize how actually hard it is to completely sanitize. Like I was on the subway and I thought, well, I don't want to grab the pole. But I have to have stability. So I'll lean against the pole. And then I realized, wait, if I'd grab the pole, I could just use a hand wipe. I'd be done. Now the thing's in my jacket and they say this survives on surfaces for like 2 days. You know, the more you think about this, the crazier you go.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I live in this apartment, and I go outside every day, long walks. And when I come back, I give myself a really thorough hand wash. And, you know, because I touch doors, you know, it really has a horror movie quality where I'm walking in the streets and then someone else walks by and we carefully like establish distances.
It is. I'm starting to see that. And I'm starting to see people really walking together at great distances, like 8 feet apart, which seems to me more than perhaps is absolutely necessary. But no, but it's like picking up the newspaper. That's not so bad because the person who tosses the newspaper isn't touching other people. But like, you realize like when you bring back the garbage from the curb, you grab the handle that the garbage man grabbed, and then you realize he's already grabbed like 500 handles that had been grabbed by other people. And I don't know, is this crazy? Am I being crazy?
No, it's not being crazy. There are people on the streets that are wearing masks. There are people wearing gloves, which occurs to me is probably a very sensible thing to do if you just have some nice gloves on.
Yeah, but it's actually easier to sanitize your hands than gloves. When you can just wash your hands and you're done. What do you do with gloves?
Well, if you got disposable gloves.
Well,
I should have bought stock in disposable gloves and masks a while ago.
Yeah. Well, we have some American politicians who did things like that.
Yes. They were savvy business people who took advantage.
It's a kind of ingenuity that made this country great.
Well, I have a friend who is not an American politician, just a very smart guy, and he bought stock in Zoom.
Yeah.
Which is the online thing you and I are talking with him. And now I think he's going to be do quite well with that.
Yeah.
You know, to be smart enough to buy stock in Zoom and Purell, Netflix, whatever.
I can't say I've done that well. I mainly just watched my retirement portfolio.
That's right. I put all my money in index funds, which have collapsed.
Yeah, it's kind of creepy. And now there's even fear that the debt market would collapse, which would have I think implications we don't even understand. I don't want to get too dark though.
So you were talking before about identifying yourself as whether or not you have had the virus and so on, and it raises the question. I mean, I'll put it this way: to some extent, I think this pandemic has made us all socialists, where everybody seems to be saying the government should do this, the government should do that. In a sense, it's made us libertarian, where at the same time, we're saying these are bullshit regulations on, HIPAA and drug testing and everything. We should, even stuff like alcohol, like what bars could do. Let's throw away these regulations. But in a sense, it might also make us kind of fascist or totalitarian. We may be willing to put up with a lot more than we otherwise would, including things like the police stop you on a street and you hold up your phone, which will indicate your health status, for instance.
Yeah. Well, even now in some cities in America, it's suddenly like illegal to, I think to actually, in Los Angeles, maybe all of California or all California cities or something, they issued an order just maybe a day ago that's basically I forget the term, but it's basically
shelter in place.
Shelter in place. And I think technically it's not clear you're allowed to even just sit there and have a conversation with somebody at a distance of like 8 feet on a corner.
Yeah.
Or even walk unless you're going to the grocery store or something. It's not clear. And that's something that if you had told me 3 months ago we'd see in America, I think I almost wouldn't be able to imagine the circumstance that would lead Americans of all people to tolerate stuff like that.
There's some place where you have to print out a permit, saying what you're doing. So you show your permit when you're, whether you're going to the store or walking your dog. I've heard there's an exemption for exercise, but then I wondered how fast do I have to be moving before it would count as exercise? I can imagine being stopped by the police and saying, I'm working out, I'm running. That's just a fast walk. That's not, you're not burning anything. No.
Yeah.
But there may be a push for really Chinese type government controls.
Well, again, I mean, we're already doing things that 3 months ago we would have called Chinese type government controls. What do you mean I can't take a walk? What do you, or whatever the thing is.
You can't have 10 people over to your house.
Yeah. Or you can't have a restaurant. Restaurants are not legal in this city anymore. Open restaurants are not legal. That just, and you do wonder if the instrument is too blunt. I think there's some wisdom in letting these things play out, some of it at the local level, because there are huge variations in how vulnerable parts of the country really are to this. But it's pretty weird.
And you can imagine a lot of this being in place not through the government, but through sort of social shaming. And I'm really against social shaming for the most part, but this may be one of the exceptions. I think of those videos of these kids doing spring break in Florida and everything, just kind of partying and stuff like that. And I think some expression of that they should be ashamed of themselves for what they're doing is suitable. And, you can imagine a restaurant being open in a city where the city has no laws against restaurants being open, but still people, go in and they say you shouldn't be doing this. Mm-hmm. You're putting other people, at risk. Well, there was a phase of that before Trump really, kind of started doing the things we expect. It was very norm dependent. We were giving, it was moral sanction. People were just kind of saying, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. And then actual regulations started coming down. And I was impressed. Well, in a way, some of it was a little of both. So there was no action at the federal level, and you would see on Twitter, discussion of what was in order, and experts would weigh in. And I think that helped lead to some action at the local and state level. Yeah. It was very much, I think, social media mediated action at some government levels. And I was impressed by that. And some of it was flat out, just social sanction. It was not government orchestrated, and that was impressive, and in some ways preferable. Obviously, the less the government, is giving you orders, kind of the better, all other things being equal. Yeah. But, you don't want to be the person, and it's a very awkward position to be the person saying, no, the government's overreaching here. They shouldn't be interfering, because there's justifiable concern by everybody that the government's doing something good. But you wonder, particularly with Trump as president, once the government gets the capacity to do certain things, whether they'll ever give it up. And 9/11, I think, is an informative example here, which is, once they got all of this power and secret organizations and everything, they're there to this day. Yeah.
And people naturally take advantages of situations like this. I remember shortly after 9/11, I was flying and I was in an airport, and you got to the place where you line up. What were we? I don't know if this was. I don't think this was security. This wasn't lining up for security. It was just that there were it was kind of crowded at the something. Anyway, there was a guy in a uniform, and he was just like, I think, kind of a private. Kind of a rent-a-cop. He wasn't officially from the government. And he was like telling people which line to get in, which I'm pretty sure he was just freelancing, Yeah. And it's like not super necessary. People are very good at deciding what the shortest line. I mean, they may be wrong, but they may turn out to be wrong as to which the fastest line was, but they're pretty good at saying, I think that line looks shorter and that's all he was facilitating, but he had just assumed this role because I think he sensed that he was in a time when people would do whatever a guy in uniform says. I don't know. But that's the concern. And I mean, the irony may turn out to be that we're screaming at Trump for not doing anything. And who knows? We may long for the days. Right. When he was, people are seriously asking questions about, well, could he postpone the election?
Yeah.
So we will see.
Yeah. And that's actually something else we talked before about why some people were ignoring this crisis. For a period, Trump was saying this is made up. This is nothing. And Fox News was saying the same thing. And at that point, the country was perfectly polarized. You had the liberal cosmopolitans who were really, really worried. And then you had the Trump supporters who were indifferent, who thought this is just made up liberals thing designed to frighten us. And then there was a day, I forget, I was reading an article saying there was a single day where Trump suddenly switched. And Trump said, no, this is serious. Fox News then totally switched and said, this is serious. And then all of America was on the same page.
Yeah, although the resistance continues to kind of complain about the job he's doing. And I mean, for this press conference, he could, even as he assumes leadership more and more in the ways you expect, like today, he said he will do something that Mayor de Blasio in New York had been screaming for him to do, which is use his emergency powers to compel certain factories to start producing surgical masks or ventilators. But even as he's doing stuff like that, he's still doing the kind of trolling stuff that I think he must take some satisfaction in knowing drives liberals crazy. And it's working. Even you in Canada, even you being a relatively sedate Canadian, were outraged by what he did at this point.
I am always willing to fall for Trump's clever machinations, And even the sort of comical stuff. This was a few weeks ago, years in pandemic time, where he had a meeting at the CDC and he went on about how the doctors told him how amazed they were at how smart Donald Trump was. They've never seen anything quite like it. So Trump himself could be a great doctor if he chose to be so, because he's kind of a genius. And, you listen to this and you're thinking like, really? Like, but it's part of the show. And I think so much of it. So I sometimes fall into the camp that sees Trump as evil genius. And so much of it is bait for people like me.
Yeah, I still sometimes am unclear on how much of it is actually calculated and how much of it just, like crazy like a fox.
Yeah.
It definitely, I think, certainly a lot of what he does that seems like trolling or whatever, or provocation, it works for him in ways that are still not appreciated by a lot of the people who are kind of falling for it. I think that much is true, but how much of it is by design, I don't know. It's like, he's like the kind of thing you just recounted. And in another press conference, he was like, and this was at a point before he'd really started doing much at all. And everybody knew that he had really waited too long to act. Yeah. The one thing he had done that maybe wasn't a bad idea was to stop the flights from China, and I guess he mentioned that and then generalized about how great he was doing, I think, and said, you can call it luck, you can call it talent. And I just thought, again, it's like, if you look at the people who like that, as opposed to just hating it, can't he take them for granted? And also just I guess I would say I still don't understand what's going on inside his brain when he does that.
If you're going to recount Trump's greatest hits on this, by the way, we can't ignore that he said his response to it is perfect. Maybe not as perfect as his letter to the Ukraine.
Meaning the transcript of the conversation.
But still perfect.
I know. Well, that's another good example. Like, that's where his brain goes. Does he think it should go there? I don't know. I think part of my theory of Trump that is not directly relevant to this, but in terms of how much of it is conscious, is he just grew up as a successful bully. Like he was a big guy. He was probably pretty good looking. He was rich, and he wasn't a genius, notwithstanding his own opinion, but he didn't exactly go to Exeter. He went to some military school that I think was academy or something, some kind of prep school that was, I think, partly for kids who wouldn't shape up or something. Anyway, it wasn't, and I doubt it was full of rich kids. So he was like the richest, biggest, pretty smart, pretty good looking guy. And for whatever reason, he came to have the disposition of a bully early on, and it worked. And he would insult people, and they would wind up groveling. And, I was watching this document. Have you seen the Errol Morris documentary with Steve Bannon?
No, I haven't.
Steve Bannon says that, the day after he won the election, or the night of it, that Steve Bannon and others were saying, okay, we won. Let's really put the screws in now. We're going to, fully implement our nefarious agenda. And he said, no, Trump said, no, I want to try to bring people together. And Trump, I think, really thought that after as big an asshole as he had been, making fun of a handicapped person, having ridiculous nicknames for competitors, he really thought, I think, that once he won, people would we're on your side. And when you think about it, that is what works for a bully. They treat you like shit, but you have to submit. And I don't know. So that's my theory. Do you have a unifying theory of Trump?
I don't have a complete theory of Trump. I have many sub theories of Trump, but I'll put it this way. The fact that Trump got elected president, now we're moving out of pandemic stuff, but that's okay.
We can get back there.
We can get back to the fact he got elected president. That's, once somebody's in the running for that, that's like a coin toss. Roughly half the country is going to vote for you. And now you're sort of quibbling over a small percentage. But the fact that he made it as a Republican nominee, squaring off against, at different times, say a dozen often highly competent, brutal, competitive, tough people, and won, means he has something going on. Mm-hmm. He has some sort of shtick, but also some sort of abilities. He survived political disasters like the Access Hollywood tape that would have destroyed a lesser man. So I think there's a lot going on with him. This isn't incompatible with what you're saying, that he's a natural bully. I think being a natural bully,
I think it's more than that. He has more than that going for him. I agree.
He has more than that. And you put him up against a pretty good, smart politician like Jeb Bush, and Trump destroys him. Marco Rubio. Anyway, just he's a real force to be reckoned with. And I think part of the issue is that in many domains of human interaction, he has no conscience. So if he felt he was going to lose the next election and he believed he could fight to have the next election called off, he would.
Oh, I think he would do anything he thought he could get away with. Yeah. I don't know. The whole thing is kind of mystery. I think he certainly understood something, he and Bannon, about a part of America that was not widely understood, about how much they hated regular politicians, about how sick they were, that they weren't really so reverent toward the war-making machine, that, and that they felt they were being sold down the river by elites. I don't think...
Yeah.
I think he got that in a way that...
no, you're right. He knew something that no one else knew. I saw him in an interview once. Yeah, as he was beginning to run. And the guy said, "I want your opinion on different people." And the guy says, our last president, last Republican president, George Bush. And Trump right away says, low IQ. And the fact that, this is not kissing his ass, not doing anything like that. He was giving a debate in the shadows, something to do with Ronald Reagan Library or something. And Trump made it clear, she was entirely indifferent to the Reagan Revolution and to what Reagan said. He didn't care. He's not a conservative in any interesting sense. He just doesn't care about tradition. And it turns out neither do a lot of Americans.
Well, my favorite was, John McCain, war hero, who was captured by the North Vietnamese and tortured. And Trump said what? He said, "I like people who don't get captured."
Yeah.
And I remember I was at a party that day, and this liberal friend of mine said, "So do you think this will do him in?" Because it wasn't at that point. It wasn't at all clear he was going to get the Republican nomination. She said, "So he can't survive this, can he?" And I said, "I wouldn't be so sure." And what he maybe knew or didn't, but turned out to be the case, is that most Americans don't really care about foreign policy. I mean, what he was doing was disrespecting, in effect, the foreign policy, national security establishment. Because John McCain is a hero there, and he's one of its leaders. Turns out a lot of Americans really don't care.
Yeah. And Trump knows this. And you're right to remind us of the game where somebody says, "Boy, this will really sink Donald Trump for sure." There's no way you recover from this one.
This brings us back to the pandemic.
The pandemic, right?
Because people have been saying, and even knowledgeable people like Michael Brendan Doherty, who from the beginning understood things about Trumpism that a lot of people didn't, because Michael's kind of a paleo conservative in the Buchanan tradition, and he early on tweeted, he said, when Trump was still in denial about this, saying, we've got 11 cases, it'll get down to 0 or something. I think Michael tweeted, I think there's now enough stuff on video of Trump being in denial that he cannot recover from this. Well, I think he almost already has. The poll, most Americans are happy with his leadership on this. And his approval rating never sunk appreciably at any point during this. And so, it's like the Roadrunner, and we're Wile E. Coyote. Is that am I recalling correctly? That's what I mean.
I think we're Wile E. Coyote.
We're Wile E. Coyote.
Yeah. This is the boomer edition.
But some things acquire classic status.
Yes.
Millennials know a lot more about our culture than I knew about my parents' culture.
That's true.
They know much more about our music.
Yes, because
they know
of the internet.
Pink Floyd. And I shouldn't say our. I mean, you're younger than I am. In fact, are you in an you're not in a really at risk population. I am. So here, between you and I... It
doesn't work on the exact date cutoffs.
Well, but there's enough difference in years so that, you and I should be at odds.
I should, be socializing and going to raves and everything.
You should be down at a beach in Florida.
Yeah. Not that I'm not tempted. Okay, so still on politics. So Biden is the guy. And Biden's going to be running against Trump. And one thing you're not happy?
Well, I've been warning about Biden's... I've got a tweet on record from, I think, 2 years ago or a year and a half warning about Biden's evident cognitive decline, which is, I think, real. It may not be dementia, but I honestly think if you look at where he was 4 years ago, that it'll be worse in November than it is now. I mean, it'll be worse when he debates Trump than it is now. That's my own view. I could be wrong.
No, I think you're right. I think people are too quick. I think people often forget what it is to be somebody of that advanced age.
I'm not saying it's dementia. It's just like he's a guy in his late 70s who hasn't aged as well as Bernie Sanders did.
Yeah. Would you have preferred the nominee to be Sanders?
Well, if I thought he could win, yeah. I mean, I put way more emphasis than the average American on foreign policy, and I like Bernie's foreign policy. If I knew he could just be put in the White House, sure.
Yeah.
And I think his chances of winning were higher than a lot of people thought, but there were problems for sure.
And whenever he did one-on-one sort of simulations, who would you vote for? Sanders did very well against Trump, better than others. But of course, he has never been tested. He has never had the sort of vicious attacks on him that other people have, including Biden, who's gone through the process.
Well, Biden has, but he's never been the presidential nominee, and also there's more. I don't know. They're already doing these dementia mashups. Although Trump has flubbed enough stuff verbally that if they do dueling mashups of bad cognitive functioning, it may be a draw.
Back when Biden, a long time ago, when Biden did the debates, the vice presidential debates, he was a surprisingly vicious and fierce debater. Very savage, but it was a while ago. Yeah,
but he was good. He was good in the vice presidential debates, surprisingly good.
Paul Ryan, was it?
I think that was one, and one was Sarah Palin, right?
Oh God, yeah. And Sarah Palin was a special case where he had to kind of tone down a little bit, and he was able to calibrate. She's
a very special lady in general.
My favorite part, there was one of those books that recounts the history of the election, and when Palin was practicing against Joe Biden, she couldn't stop in the practice sessions calling him "Oh Biden," because his verbal text, she kept saying, "Well, oh Biden," and then finally, so the solution they came up with is, and you see this at the beginning of the debate, she goes up and says, "Can I call you Joe?" And of course, Joe Biden says, "Oh, of course you can." And then she calls him Joe for the whole thing to avoid the embarrassment of calling him "Oh Biden."
Oh, so, I had thought that had a different logic behind it. Anyway, go ahead.
But so anyway, I what I like about Biden, and this is sort of a sort of old school conservative point, is that he represents.
Are you a closet conservative, Paul? I've been wanting to see if I could get you out of the closet here.
I am not a closet conservative. My political views are eclectic and complicated, and far more nuanced for normal categories.
Yeah, more than I could comprehend. We need to get.
I think it's a standard academic liberal with some strange leanings,
with some IDW proclivities.
Oh God, no! We'll just edit that part out.
No, I mean, I think there are a lot of academics who, the social justice warriors have been a pain for them. And I think what I will say is there are more liberal academics than you might imagine who, if you get them in a private conversation, will say some of the kinds of things about social justice warriors that the IDW says out loud.
I think that's fair enough. And I'll put myself in the category of somebody who's extremely supportive of free speech and open discourse, and think that the sort of no platforming and public shaming, the vicious attacks on people who have views that are even the slightest bit beyond orthodoxy is terrible.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I'm not as obsessed with the social justice warriors as some of my colleagues are, some of the dark web people are. Anyway, I'm conservative in this sense about Biden, which is Biden, unlike Sanders, will bring us back to normal. Will bring us back to a world where there's sort of the standard, competent, bureaucratic government. We will go for weeks without thinking deeply about what the president thinks or what he has to say. And it will hopefully return us from the sort of Trump disaster back to something we had when Obama was president, which I remember with great nostalgia.
That's his pitch. Return to normalcy.
Return to normal. Remember those 8 years of Obama? Wasn't that nice? Well, it was Obama, Biden. Don't forget.
I long for the days when I can just not even think about who the president is. Biden would in some ways make that easy.
That should be his pitch.
Vote
Biden and never think about it again.
Yeah. Vote Joe. You'll forget he's president.
That's right.
Or Joe Who, just that would say it. The bumper sticker says Joe Who, vote Joe Who. So on this pandemic thing, though, well, quickly I wanted to ask you: do you worry about this revealing that professors aren't strictly speaking necessary. They can just record their lectures once. You pay them for a year, and then send them to Toronto where they have to work in a restaurant or something if they want to make a living.
Boy, this is taking a turn.
Well, no, but there will be. I mean, this is in a way a serious question. We're gonna learn more about what we can do with technology. I mean, like I think the remote visits to doctors' offices are going to stay, and I'm glad.
I think there's a lot that's going to be better.
Yeah.
And I think that we're going to have more and more remote meetings, remote contact. The idea of teleconferencing with my doctor, I need to update my prescription for something. And we just spent, a minute going back and forth on video is tremendously efficient. There's so many things that could be improved, but I'm not sure university teaching is one of them. So this is a case, what you're asking me is actually a case where my views have flipped in the opposite direction. When MOOCs came into being, these giant online courses, I thought along with a lot of other people, they were going to put universities out of business. Not Harvard or Yale or Princeton. Those will always stay because they're about a lot of other things. But big state schools, which don't have any special names and have, fine professors and everything. But the people running them will say, why do we have to hire a bunch of political science professors when we could tell the students to watch this MOOC and that MOOC and this MOOC and that MOOC and have graduate students teach them? And I thought this was going to be this revolution, and I was wondering, a terrible revolution, a good revolution, and none of it happened. None of it happened. For some reason, I think there's different things going on. I think one thing going on, something which no one would have anticipated, which is students do not learn as much from online courses. For something about it, when you're not in person, you shut off. Mm-hmm. You look at the data on people who finished the courses. The courses are mostly taken by retired people. They're not taken by young people. And most people don't finish the courses. It's like a book. You start it and you don't finish it. So I don't think that this experience of online teaching is going to cause universities and colleges to shut down. I would have thought this a few years ago, not anymore.
Although, I mean, my premise is that the pandemic is forcing a kind of experiment that wasn't really done by Coursera per se. I mean, the MOOCs went online, but we didn't have a situation where, universities were going to award credit for courses for classes taught remotely. That's about to happen. At least half of the semester will have been taught remotely.
Yeah.
And maybe they'll learn. I mean, there are a lot of forces that naturally resist Coursera, like professors.
Right?
And also, I mean, you're an elite. You're at Yale. I mean, Yale, of course, people go to Yale for all kinds of reasons. Certainly to meet the other students who are going to rule over the rest of us once they get out of college, and so can do it in concert with their secret handshakes and stuff.
Yeah.
And also, FaceTime with the great professors who will give their future overlords the first step up the ladder, and so on. And so that's one thing. But if you're talking about junior college, big state college, it's a different kind of thing.
Yeah, and I would have thought, we can view this as market inefficiency, which is that, however you view this, I would have thought a big state school would say we could save so much money by offering credit to good online courses. You take Michael Sandel at Harvard, teaches a course on justice, an online course, and I saw a bit of it, and it's a gorgeous course. It's interesting, it's fascinating, it's well taught. Probably a student who took that course would have a better experience, more substantive experience than taking 99% of the professors who are already around. So why don't they assign that instead? Well, the answer is because I think in part because professors run the show at universities, and we would not abide by that.
Right.
I would not be happy if instead of assigning my intro psych lecture course, they said, oh, no, take this thing that's just online instead, because then what am I going to teach? And are we going to lower the size of our faculty, which would be horrible for the faculty? So I think that for better or worse, the fact that professors tend to run a lot of universities will keep these MOOCs from getting traction.
Right. I agree. Although this experiment we're doing may give them a new kind of challenge.
And here's something else. Suppose that the pandemic continued through September. If I was a university president, that would keep me up at night. Any college, any university, because are students really going to spend $60,000, $70,000 a year to go to a university or college and take the classes from their house? Like, do this entirely online?
No.
All of the things you mentioned about the Yale students becoming the masters of the universe and overlords of all of us involve being in New Haven with other students.
Well, or at least meeting the other students. And it's hard to imagine bonding with the other students and learning from them. And it's hard to imagine right now a virtual replication of that experience. Although, who knows how crazy how much experimentation will get done. I was thinking like, when they first said, well, we're going to have the like March Madness and various professional sports will continue, but without fans, I thought, well, you could, they could, what'll it be like to watch without cheering? But then I thought, well, they could kind of, by hooking up fans from each side who are watching from home and having like microphones and kind of blurring them all together, you could get crowd reaction. And
video games do that sort of thing. Halo.
So, things like that. I may probably soon will have the first ever video conference of my family, my wife and me and two daughters, because they don't want to come here because they're afraid they might be carriers and infect us. And although we encourage them, and so that may happen. So well, go ahead. What are you going to say?
This is going to change. I would never thought I'd be asking this question. Do you miss hugging people? Do you miss shaking hands?
Upside to this is that there's no hugging in the new universe.
Yeah.
I'm
very
not,
Seinfeldian reaction.
I'm not a hugger. I did not grow up among huggers. Where I come from, you hug your spouse, and that will do. Thank you.
Okay, fair enough. But you must hug your children occasionally.
I do hug my children. You could hug your children, although, my father was not a big child hugger even.
Was he a firm handshake man?
Yeah, no, it's like a father-son thing was a handshake. Yeah, where I grew up. How about you?
The same. Not a big physical contact family, but with my own kids, a lot of physical contact, a lot of hugging and sort of climbing on top of each other and wrestling. I have two sons, and a lot of sort of wrestling and punching and sort of knocking each other down. And I kind of it is weird to see an old friend or to see a family member and you kind of wave at them from a distance or touch feet or something. Mm-hmm. You kind of miss the social contact.
It is. Oh yeah. No, I'm perfectly fine with handshakes. In fact, what I had hoped feminism would do for us is usher in a world, not the only thing, but would usher in a world in which you shake hands with men, you shake hands with women. Because leaving aside whether you enjoy hugging, there's like the uncertainty. Like, do I know her? Am I on hugging terms with her? Am I on, So
many of us were hoping for equal rights for women, but that's good too.
This is equal rights. They isn't it? They get to shake my hand. Where a privilege previously reserved for my male friends.
No, there is. You're right. There is an awkwardness. There's a cross-gender awkwardness.
It doesn't make sense. Why should it be?
I think you're right. I think there should be a standardized thing. If you kiss cheeks, fine, but not for you, but in another culture, you should do it for men and for women.
Right.
If it's a firm handshake, if it's a fist bump,
men and women.
You could imagine one consequence of this in that if we establish social distancing of some form or another forever, is that the handshake will go. It'll be replaced by the elbow bump or the fist bump. You
can't imagine. I agree that those are unsatisfactory. There's something about the handshake that embodies embrace without being an embrace.
Very nice. Yes.
I'm pro handshake.
Yeah.
But here's my question is kind of how grim could this get? Because here's the thing is like, at this point, we're all saying this is a whole new universe, but it's not yet that different from what we're used to because the U.S. isn't yet Italy, and even Italy isn't 1/10 of what, in principle, is possible if it continues to get out of control in Italy. I mean, it's not yet truly apocalyptic, and yet, thanks to the power of exponential growth, it could be not that long before things really seem dark, right? So what is your sense for how likely that is or what?
I don't know. I've been looking at the projections like everybody else, and it could get very, very dark indeed. I mean, what could happen is exponential growth takes its toll. We don't have antivirals that quickly. We don't have vaccines in the sort of 12-month to 18-month window everybody talks about. And the economy collapses. And we live in this bizarre sort of in-between state. Could be for a year, could be for longer, where we're locked up, where businesses, where restaurants and bars collapse. And it could be a case where there's enough, where our hospital system, and I hope this doesn't happen, turns into sort of an Italian-like situation where older people we love might get afflicted with the virus and go to a hospital and then die because they're triaged out. Mm-hmm. There's not enough resources to care for them, and they're too old to merit full focus. And I'm enough of a sort of utilitarian to say I appreciate that there has to be decisions being made, and I don't have an in-principle objection to deciding them on a basis of age and other considerations. But the thought of people I love, specific people I know and love, going to the hospital with the virus and not getting access to medical care because they're too old is terrible. Yeah. So that's what it could be.
No, it could. I guess my optimistic scenario is this: through a series. I mean, we're not going to nip it in the bud, and the terrible thing about it is because it's so transmissible that if you just kind of subdue it to a tolerable level and then say, okay, life's back to normal, it does start spreading again.
Then it will come back again
until you reach so-called herd immunity, which involves 70% of the population having had it. But I think my optimistic scenario is that several things blunt the near-term impact. Older people start doing an extreme job of isolation. We apparently have no hope of vaccine within a year, but we develop, or not even develop, we find that existing drugs, some of which are now being tested, are effective, at least somewhat effective treatments. So that further reduces the mortality rate. The seclusion of seniors having been one thing that would reduce the mortality rate. And then we use technology in clever ways. One professor had this, in some ways Orwellian, but it was a thing of using phone monitoring, monitoring people's phones in a way that you could really precisely track transmission. But even that aside, using technology to identify people who are immune, who at least have had it and are presumed immune, and having them play constructive roles of various kinds, including just going out and buying stuff and ordering coffee and reviving the economy. I guess you can imagine that combination of things getting us through. Slowly the rate of transmission would drop as more and more people were immune, and that getting us through to the point where a vaccine is available without really horrendous loss of life. I mean, tens of thousands of people dying, as happens with a bad flu epidemic, in America, as opposed to hundreds or even 1 million or 2. So that's,
so in that optimistic scenario, 3 months from now, July 1st, this beautiful, warm summer day, are we having lunch at our favorite restaurants?
No, because the other, I mean, yes, because I really think the degree of social distancing and seclusion we're doing now, carried on for months and months, will lead to a true global depression. I mean, it's just an intuition, but depressions kill people in their own way.
Yeah.
And it's not just a question of having a little less stuff. It's like people having trouble eating. And I suspect that we're going to have to relax the social distancing, I think, within a couple of months, because of the economic feedback we're getting.
So you think at some point, in some way, this isn't quite the optimistic scenario. You think at some point the economic costs will be so harsh, we'll have to say, we're going to relax social distancing, and a lot of people are going to get sick. We know that, but we're just going to have to deal with that.
Well, what I'm hopeful of is that within a couple of months, some of these things will have happened.
Yeah.
We'll have realized, the seniors, you've got to stay. We've got to take more precautions than ever to keep you secluded, and people with vulnerabilities. We've got maybe one drug that, say, reduces mortality rate by 50%. And, in other words, a few things happen that make this something other than what you're hearing now about the herd immunity scenario where, 2% of the people die. Yeah. So I'm suggesting that within a couple of months we could have things in place that greatly reduce the cost of relaxing social distancing.
Well, that's nice. I like that.
That's all I can do.
I like that. You've put in a surprising role for you of the optimist.
That's what people have come to expect from me. But it seems not crazy, and it's not all sunny.
Crazy.
I mean, you have significant numbers of deaths.
Yeah.
So, anything else you want to say about?
It's honestly hard to talk about or think about any other issues in these times.
It absolutely is.
We should meet up again and talk about something entirely different. Have a no corona edition.
Okay. Maybe we should make a date. Well, here's a question is say in a month, is it possible that the environment will have been so changed that it's almost impossible to talk about anything else? Or, eventually people just have to change the subject, right? Even if it gets grim.
Yeah. During World War II, I imagine there was a point where people said, let's not talk about the war. And they talked about other things. Yeah.
Well, let's plan to check in about a month then.
Yeah.
You'll be free. Now that you're a mere, there's an automated version of you teaching your course.
That's right. And I'm forbidden to leave my country. So I'll be here. I'll be right here.
Okay. So let's plan on that. Well, thanks, Paul.
Thank you for having me on.
Tell people where they can reach you. Paul Bloom at Yale. That's AT. Spell it out. At is your Twitter handle. Right? Yeah.
And my email is should I send me?
Wait, you're going to give people your email? You want to give people your email?
No, it just reflects it. No, I have no email. Don't. That's fine. That was a slip.
That was the Canadian in you, the nice guy in you, wanting to offer yourself up to.
I'm going to give my cell phone number.
Yeah, I don't think you have. Yeah, give me your address. Okay.
Just find me on the streets of Toronto.
Won't be hard.
That's the best way. It won't be hard.
Okay.
Okay. Take care.
All right. You too. Thanks a lot.